I remember him taking some glass of something. I don't know what is it that he took to drink on that day. So don't listen to everything that he says. My name is my name is Mzwandile Molo. I'm going to start there because I want to locate myself in this conversation. I come from a small town in the southern Cape of South Africa called Oudtshoorn. And I tell this story because as much as one grew up in the church and as a Christian, one had an ambivalent relationship with the church. That ambivalence is located in many ways. The church in South Africa was part of the dehumanization journey of many Black South Africans. Part of the church's presence here has meant the church were almost in the frontier of the dispossession of the Black people of South Africa. Tutu has a saying that they came, they held the Bible in one hand and they asked us to pray. When we opened our eyes, they had the land and we had the Bible. And it tells you the kind of ambivalence that comes with the church in this country. And that ambivalence created, especially for myself, an enormous tension, because that tension meant that I needed to say to myself, either I accept the church as an instrument of my dehumanization, colonization, capitalist exploitation, and loss of dignity. I should either take it like that. And the history of our country is replete with that existence. From the time that the church came, it came in some instances, it came to be of some spiritual support to the soldiers, to those who dispossessed the land. So they didn't come here primarily wanting to bring the gospel. They came here to service those who were at the forefront of our dispossession. It is only later when some of them began to say, maybe there is a need to spread the gospel. And then they decided to see the Black population, therefore, as an expression of the spreading of the gospel. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is a church that has been involved in the emancipation of people, both in terms of education, in terms of skilling of our people, in terms of imagination, and the greater resistance of the early years of our struggle, even to the birth of what the ANC has been people who have been brought up in church schools, in church institutions, who were then brought up as this middle class that emerges within the national structure of Black South Africans. And they almost became to be the critical voice because they were being now empowered and skilled enough to engage with the oppression of their people. And therefore they could use things like deputations and all kinds of stuff to engage. So the church in many ways also became the birthplace of many of the resistant movements in South Africa. And that tension then was further expressed as we moved on in my own age, where you could see then that amongst the church, there were those who pacified the masses, who tried to convince the masses that either this is what God intended for the world to be, and we just must accept that there are slaves and there are different castes of people who must exist in a divinely ordained way. And there are those who said these things are not necessarily godly. You know, let's leave politics to politicians. Let us just pray that all things are going to go right, and maybe one day we'll get into heaven. And when we get into heaven, because we've enjoyed a lot, we've got a special place in heaven. So blessed are the poor, not because they inherit the land, because if they remain in their poverty, when the pearly gates open, they are going to receive these beautiful gifts from God. And then there was the prophetic tradition, the tradition that began to speak prophetically about God's justice for the world, about God's demand for a fairer world, for a world where dignity is a given, where there is no black or white, where there is no poor, there's no rich, where there is no women, there is no men. So how that then became this driving force in the life of the church. And in many instances, that became the savior of Christian credibility in the South African experience. because the other two spheres, literally speaking, the majority of our people were dismissed either as complete to the oppression or as useless rhetoric that makes people slumber in the depth of their poverty. So that was dismissed. The prophetic tradition, which began to be represented by people like Mzwandile, if you read the South African history context, from there you've got Buti Tlhagale, from there you've got Desmond Tutu, you've got Ellen Busaks of them. So that generation emerges then in the late 70s, early 80s, informed by this idea of Black consciousness as a starting point. And that Black consciousness is connected back to people like Du Bois, who in the turn of the last century began speaking about this Blackness thing. And then Frantz Fanon emerges as a point of reference about that work around black skin, black mask, white skin. And then Steve Biko then emerges as a big proponent and begins to make the church uncomfortable in asking these very serious questions about what is the role of faith in the presence of oppression. That created then this vibrancy and this powerful prophetic presence expressed during those times. That almost catapulted the country into a presence of the church in a context where political parties were banned, where politicians were in jail, others were in exile. And people like Busak and Tutu and them took the center stage. And in that center stage, the church then began to be seen as a vehicle of transformation and change. That is how I enter this conversation. I enter this conversation, therefore, as somebody who has lived with the thing that says the church can be an instrument of great oppression and pain. Yet at the same time, the church can be an instrument of great liberation and great power to transform the world. So I live in that, and that allows me to say, I do not therefore inevitably give the church the power to transform or the power to oppress. My first starting point is the church, like any movement, who have lived for as long as the church has lived, exists in a very tenuous existence where it can be a defender, explainer, and pacifier of oppression in the context where it sides with the powerful. It sides with those who have money. It sides with those who've got material power. It also sides with the media. That begins then to give a narrative of how society should be. And the church, therefore, as institution, is also self-preserving, because what the church seeks to do sometimes, it is to do things that make sure that it survives. And at the local level, you are going to find local churches when you want to engage in popular struggles. The local church simply wants to survive. They want to talk about how many people come to worship. They want to talk about the volume of worship itself. They want to talk about how much money they can make. And if all these things can align with the powerful, they will choose to go with the powerful. Because sometimes these things are not located in the disenfranchised and the less powerful people. It takes a prophetic presence within the church to begin then to be that voice that speaks and critiques within the church, firstly, to remind the church of its primary commitment. Its primary commitment is to God, not to populism. Its primary commitment, it is to God, not to temporal power. Its primary commitment, it is to God, not to be seen amongst the powerful. Now, that can also easily be used by those who are powerful. When we say commitment to God, we are clear which God we talk about. We're not talking of a God who is neutral in the presence of oppression. Tutu had the saying, and the saying was, you cannot talk neutrality whilst the elephant has its feet on the tail of a mouse, and you say you want to be neutral. You can't speak like that. You have to find the ways to know that God has made a choice, and that choice is to be on the side of justice. And the side of justice means being on the side of the silenced, being on the side of the exploited, being on the side of the oppressed, not merely as an act of solidarity, but as an act of agency. as an act of saying to the poor people, part of God's vision for your life is for you to be active in your own transformation of your reality. So God does not just choose to be on the side of the oppressed for the sake of saying, I want you to feel nice because I'm here with you. The gospel demands of those who are oppressed. If we preach gospel to them, we preach a gospel that demands of them to be activated as agents of their own transformation. So we are not simply saying we just want to be with you and want to walk with you. We are saying if we are a prophetic church, we are going to be a church that deliberately says, we are with you in the project of liberating yourselves from this oppression. But much more importantly, we're not only liberating you from this oppression so that we substitute you with your oppressor. We are activating you as an agent of the gospel to create a higher level of what it is to be a God-led and a justice-led society, so that the oppressed do not aspire to be in the place of the oppressor, but the oppressed aspire to create a radically different world where the experience of exclusion is a foundation of their dreaming imagination of that which is fundamentally different from what is right now. So we are not simply activating people to be pacified, nor are we activating the gospel with them so that they're able to be agents of transformation, so that they can replace the oppressor. It is that we are radically asking them to have a different vision, what Christian, or what you guys might call a eschatological vision, that transcends what they have experienced. Because if you do not do that, I can tell you, South Africans, if you do not do that, there is a very dangerous experience that we have, where the elite easily replace the struggles of the people with their own narrow class, if not personal interest. So what you then get is that you've got the elite who simply remove those who are in powerful positions so that they themselves can occupy that positions of power without a commitment to a radically different world. And that has lent Africans with that reality in the African continent, that in the last 50 years, we are not only dealing with the vestiges of colonialism, we are also dealing with the co-option of those who are elite, who have become presidents, who have become business people, who have become the middle class, who aspire to be like the middle class of the oppressed in the past, and therefore commit themselves to ethics and visioning that is limited to what they've experienced to them. So when we talk, therefore, of public theology, in my view, and I have to say, I'm a little bit concerned about narrowing of theology, because sometimes that makes other people think it's not something. For me, when we talk about public theology, we're simply saying God is at the center of the transformation of the world. And that center drives us towards a commitment to a radical love and a radical freedom that allows people not to see their place of origin as the end of who they can be, but see that as the base in the transformation of the world, so that in that transformation of the world, radical love, not love of warmth feeling, radical love committed to the dignity and the transformation of systems of the world that allow people to feel that they are fully human, but not only fully human, they are connected to creation as partners with creation in God, in beautifying the world, rather than exploiting and extracting from the world. Those are the kind of brief comments I can share, and if we want them to engage further, we can.
Wow, thank you, Reverend Molo. I was like furiously writing down so much as you were speaking. There's so much there and it's so energizing. Wow, okay. I think I'll begin with a few questions for you based on what you just shared. And as we're conversing, fellows, if you just want to be thinking about questions you might have for Reverend Molo and this radical vision that you've painted for us, but also just given some examples of how that's been lived in South Africa. Okay, Reverend Molo. Yeah.
Yes. I'm with you. I'm listening, Chase.
Awesome. Okay, my first question for you. You spoke about ambivalence coming from within the church and the church acting as an instrument of your own dehumanization. What are some ways that we can recognize dehumanization, and what ties might you see between religion, nationalism, and dehumanization?
Thank you, Chase. The South African experience has taught me, at least, the following. The first thing it taught me is the church easily justifies the exploitation of the other in a way that makes it palatable to the people, with this idea that it is godly for those who are excluded to accept their exclusion from the means of dignified living. Because if you're able to pacify people to that, you take away their agency. They cannot imagine a different world, because the world that they have now been given by their political structure, economic structure, and even attitude towards what creation is supposed to, then the church easily then becomes, it rationalizes, sanctifies, and purifies that kind of existence, and allows people then to get to a sense where they can't even imagine a different world. Secondly, it creates a categorization of human dignity that is based on race, that is based on class, that is based on geography in many instances. It now begins to tell people that in a certain context, if you are Black, it is part of God's intention that your Blackness is an exclusion to the dignified living. And therefore, it begins to give you that kind of idea that says, if you go by race, and then what it does, it creates this caste, and then creates a dangerous thing, which I call it gives messianic prominence to races and groups. It creates this idea that a certain group it has got a messianic purpose in the world, and therefore in the lives of ordinary people. In South Africa, we were told that white people have come here so that they can save these barbaric individuals from their own self-destruction. And therefore, if they want to meet God, they better meet this white God who's communicated to them, to the white face, to the white eyes, to the white language, to the white imagination. And because of that, then what you end up with is you've got a deep dehumanization of one's culture, deep dehumanization of one's existence, and you don't even exist. In South Africa, there was a time in the late 70s where there was an industry called of skin bleaching. That industry made millions of rands. This was the motive of that industry. You are too Black. You need to buy, the big thing then was Hymen or Escamel. You need to buy that so that put it in your face so that you can bleach your face. In bleaching that face, you become more white, you become more civilized, and therefore you are not as Black as you can be. The tragedy about that, my face might be whiter in terms of complexion, but my hands are still Black. Sometimes my neck is still Black. And therefore, the church then creates that foundation, that moral frame that allows dehumanization to be the experience of the people. It goes to scripture. It nitpicks scripture into fitting this narrative of the powerful. And out of that, I call it, we are now going to a phase which I call the bleaching of the soul. That we didn't only bleach our appearance. Our soul has been bleached enough so that we aspire anything and everything that is white, because our souls have no existence outside of that. And what the church has done then, it has given liturgical expressions of that dehumanization. It has given sermonic power to those dehumanization. It has given hymnology around those those identifications. And therefore, the church has become this support structure to the dehumanization of a whole people. And in many instances, the movement from apartheid into New South Africa has created a shield for the church which has not dealt with their own complicity in the continued exploitation of people. And because of that, we now have moved without real soul searching into this idea that we are now this rainbow nation and everybody should be happy. That's how the church has come. In the current context, economically, the church has chosen a side. And the church has chosen the side of the powerful, those who've got money. The church has chosen a side on the issues of sexuality and gender identity. The church has taken a side. And the church has taken such a side that it hides its complicity by arguing that it is still studying, it is still researching, whilst the oppression and dehumanization of people continue. So that's how then the church plays this power of literally being the structure, if not the roots, of the dehumanization of people.
Wow. As you're talking, I'm just thinking of so many parallels that, I mean, Andrew was just saying, we see here in the United States of religion kind of co-opted as the infrastructure of preserving ideas of whiteness and power. Okay, in the face of churches being complicit in dehumanization, you also said there's this opposite side of church being the birthplace of the people of the resistance. And I'm wondering if you can identify maybe just a few key things that might be different in the theologies of these two different churches that you described.
Andrew referenced the kind of document that you guys have dealt with, have been dealing with. That is a fundamental understanding of the definition of these two churches. If you remember, that document talks of state theology, which is not what I'm going to be talking about now, because the state theology is one that justifies the state as we understand it. But the church theology hides behind neutrality, hides behind heavenly language, hides behind prayers, hides behind praise, as if praise is an otherworldly expression of our relationship with God. It hides within the institution, that the institution needs to be preserved, because if we don't preserve the institution, we have got nothing. The institution, then it hides behind this idea that fundamentally God has nothing to do with the world. God has got everything to do with heaven, and all we need to do is to find a way to go to heaven, and the quicker we get there, the better. The church hides in what I call the need to be accepted by everybody. Somehow there's this idea that God is God because God will be accepted by everybody. If there are people unhappy with you, then you're not godly. If whatever the basis of their unhappiness with you. And therefore, we want this church to be this place where everybody just comes in and we can sing. I think your expressions in the state is kumbaya. We have this kumbaya thing where we're just like, oh, okay, we are nice and we're happy with one another. And there's other one, though, that I think is more audacious and more cancerous. The church worships power. I want to stop that. I really want you to hear me very well about that. The church doesn't worship God. The church is not interested in the God who's radical. The church is not interested in the God who says a new earth and a new heaven. See, the church is not interested in that God who says the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. The church is not interested in that God. The church is not interested in that God who struggles, and to use Pope Francis' language, who smells like the sheep. The church is interested in buying the latest car, in building the latest huge, humongous building. The church is interested in the God who simply showers them with these material things. And when you speak, therefore, of the God who makes a choice for the poor, who makes a choice to radically change the world, That God is alien to the church. If he's not alien, he's an irritant to the church. And the church simply says, no. And then the church of God has allowed itself to be nationalized, if not tribalized, if not racialized. Because the narrower the identity, the more confident we are of God's presence and protection. The God who ventures into new avenues, the God who ventures into spaces where justice drives, where love drives. And by love, we mean the one who radically exposes yourself to the vulnerability of the other, such that you are not complacent in their own injustice. The God who presents to us as a God who moves from simply saying, I'm not only interested in carrying you on my donkey or whatever to take you to the place where you are not to be healed. The God who says to the innkeeper, you know what? Whatever debt you collect in taking care of this person, keep it on my tabs. I am prepared to pay the debt because my loving this person calls on me not only to be rhetorically in love, but to be resourceful, to be resource love. And therefore, if there is debt to be paid, I'm prepared to pay that debt. And if you are lived in a church of nationalization, therefore national debt becomes your priority. Your tribal debt becomes your priority, regardless of what it does to the common expression of the world and what it is to live in responsibility and solidarity with creation. The radical church, therefore, is one that must always take this point, and I want to say this to you. That radical church is never in the majority. That church that is committed to a radically different vision is never popular. Desmond Tutu was never popular in South Africa. When he moved from the SACC to join the Anglican Church as the Archbishop of Cape Town, many white people left the church. I do not know whether you guys know, I read some years ago, Tavis Smiley's book about Martin Luther King of his last year or so, where he says, even in the Black community, he was one of the most unpopular people in the Black community because he decided to take on poverty. He decided to take on the war, Vietnam War. So that radical church must always remember it is the yeast. It is not the dough. It is the yeast. And if you are the yeast, you must always remember that you exist as a way to disseminate who you are rather than preserve who you are. And what that church needs, before I go on, Chase, I stop there. What that church needs is a radical commitment internationally to begin to say to ourselves, there is a counter vision that must counter the narrow vision of self-interest, of greed, of materialism, the narrow interest of toxic nationalism. That vision needs that church to stand up and say, this is what we believe in. And because we believe in it, we are prepared to be bent for it. Because as we get bent, the light shines. The more we don't want to be bent for this vision, the more this vision is unable to exist.
Wow, you are preaching to us, Reverend Molo. Thank you. Thank you. In the face of this church that worships power, Andrew mentioned this in the chat. We've been talking a little bit about the public theologian and where is their home? Where do they find belonging? And I guess I want to pose that question we've been asking back to you in the face of a church that is worshiping power. And maybe for some of us, there doesn't feel like an obvious resistant church or movement, what's the public theologian's responsibility and where should they find a home, if at all?
The first reference I want to make is to remember the words of Christ. You are the salt. You are the salt. You are the salt of the earth. And I just want to, because I want to reference back, the salt is never the majority of the food. It never is the majority of the food, the salt. And if you know that you are the salt of, if you know that you are the salt of the world, then you know these basic things, in my view. Your power lies in connectivity. The public theologian must know they are not a loner. You must live in connectivity. One grain of salt makes no difference unless it is connected with other grains of salt. So the first point is, public theologians must accept the truth that we do not have a messianic syndrome. Our critique of the current church and the critique of the world and the power relations must dissuade us from this idea that we are the messianic. We are not the ones sent out there to save the world, because once you do that, then you spend yourself so much and spread yourself so thin that your activity, your passion, your energy is the same place where you generate disillusionment. You generate hopelessness because you've got this messianic thing. So we derive our power in our connectivity. And that connectivity exists both in church and also in society. It's quite interesting. The greatest speeches of Martin Luther King Jr. were not made in churches. The one about, which I don't think is greatest speech, to be frank with you, you my Americans love it. I have a dream. You love that one. So I'm going to leave that to you because you love that one. The one he talks of, what title of that talk? What now? Something like that, where he speaks about where to move at a given juncture. I just forgotten now the title of his talk, where he's trying to give a general description of what the church has done, where to go bread basket and all kinds of stuff. When he transits into the issues of poverty, when he begins to speak about who owns the oil, when he begins to say, oh, how can we spend billions to take people to the moon and we can't solve the people on the ground. When it's begin, so that is not made in a church text. Where do we go from here? Yes, and where do we go from here? When he begins to speak like that, his greatest speech, some of which is his speech before his death, is not made in a church. It is made in Memphis, Tennessee, if I understand the history well. What is the context? The context are workers who are, and therefore the public theologian must realize something that the Latin American theologian discovered, that the greatest power of God does not lie in the church, it lies in the people. Connecting with the popular struggles of people and allowing the imagination of the poor, the imagination of the people to bring us new imagination, but also new language. But we do not engage the public space as if we've got all the language of liberation and God's transformation presence. Allow those who are in the forefront of this struggle bring us new information, new language, new ways of thinking, so that we don't get stuck in the stale, cold theological language that does not transform that doesn't energize the church. And the last thing is, although the church is what it is, to have a long-term view of the church. I tell people, I am a Christian, but I'm also a Marxist enough to know that the power to transform the world lies in the masses. It never lies in the leaders. And therefore, if I give up on the church, I'm giving the church over to the ones who worship power. So I decide to be what I call a disturbing presence in the halls of the church. I don't see the church as an institution to those who worship power and money. I know I'm not in the majority, but I become that salt that becomes this disturbing presence. This presence that makes them uncomfortable to be where they want to be. And once I'm able to do that, loving it, committed to its future, committed to its power, being able to be that presence that allows you for people to know. You know what normally happens, Chase? Sometimes the people who worship power like to narrate public theologians and radical theologians as people who don't love the church. What I normally to say to public theologians, to say, tell the ordinary people, you love the church as much as these guys love the church. You love the church as much as they do, maybe even much more than they do, but because you must be humble, you can't say you love it more than they do. You love the church, but most importantly, you love the world more than you love the church. Not because it is your choice, it is God's choice. It is God who loves the world more than God loves the church. That is the truth of our gospel.
Thank you, Reverend Molo. That is so radical, this vision of being the salt. And honestly, it aligns so much with some of the questions that were being asked last week. Hasa, I'm just thinking about your question about what is the church, and Reverend Molo, you've given us this idea of God being present in 2 or 3 people resisting a church that worships power. And that's a really radical vision. I feel like I could just ask you questions all day, but self-control, I'm going to ask you one last question before I pass it on to our fellows. So fellows, be getting ready for your questions. But in this vision, what does courage mean to you? And what practices do you suggest for strengthening our courage?
Thank you. The birthplace of courage is your own discomfort. Unless you are discomforted, you have no courage to talk, to imagine, to think. So the first place to be courageous at, it is to allow discomfort. Some of the people some of you might, Cornel West has this idea of allowing the poor to speak into our powerful positions. In other words, to allow yourself to be so discomforted that you know this is not supposed to be. That's the first point. That's the birthplace of courage. The second place of courage is it is once you're discomforted, it is have the courage to imagine something different. Once you are discomforted, you come to this place that says things should not be like this. The second point is to imagine something different, to imagine differently. And this is important, at least for me, because without that imagination of something differently, you become a loose cannon who simply acts because you want to act. There is no commitment to a different vision that guides your actions. And because there's no commitment to a different vision for you to do, you act recklessly, and then you want to be this hero. You want to be this martyr who's seen to be this person who simply is doing that. And beyond that, when you gain power, whatever means you gain power, you have no foundations to use that power because that power has no master. That power in itself is the pursuit. And therefore, if you've got a different vision for the world, different values, I tell to my people that if you've got a radical different vision, and for me, the most powerful vision we have is radical love. That's my imagination, because John says God is love, and when God is love, and for that radical love that you have, then power has a master, and that master is love. And I say to my congregation, to the people that have power without master is radical it is tyranny. Power with no master, it is tyranny. Power at its best is a servant, and that servant is radical love. And once we have that, then we then begin to say to ourselves, we are discomforted, we see the radical. So the first step of public courage is the power to say no. Simply the power to say no. Not to seek to be in the majority, not to seek to be popular, but simply the power to say no. Because once you've got the power to say no, you disturb the rationalization of oppression. You disturb the sanctification of the power dynamics. Simply say, no, it can't be. And that no can be expressed in different ways. Then there is what I call courageous actions then. Having said no, having known what you stand for, you do not only have the courage to fight that which is dominant, but the courage to commit for that which is different. And there's a big difference, my friends, between the two. It's sometimes easy to commit to destroy. It is something radically different to commit to some different value system. Because once you've got that, then your choices of weapons of struggle are determined by what you see and what you want to fight for. You are not kept by nihilism. You are not kept by hopelessness. And then you've got this wonderful view of history that says victories are not in the moment that we win or lose. Victories are found in the determination of those who are committed to the cause, that even if their lives are spent in the moment and they seem defeated, they have this idea that it might be Friday today and the sacrifices of today are needed. But for goodness sake, there is a new possibility because that's the courage then that comes. Because you know, Chase, that I might appear like losing today. Whenever I'm excited, whenever I talk about this thing to people, I always say to people, be careful of being the Joseph who is stuck in the pit. Because that Joseph who's stuck in the pit doesn't see the coming of the brothers in Egypt and say, we are hungry. So if you want easy victories, if you want easy successes, do not be one who's committed into this cause. Because this cause has no easy victories. For goodness sake, those who have lived through what was called the Arab Springs know this story better than I do. That when they thought they have won, if you take Egypt, when they thought they have won in Egypt, the military gave them a shining object, as you say. The military gave them Mubarak. And the people followed chasing Mubarak rather than following the. And after Mubarak was gone, Assisi changed from an army chief into a politician. Assisi now is the president of Egypt. The people's struggles have been hijacked. I do not want to go to that phrase that talks about how David, the king, hijacked the narrative of the people of Egypt and took the covenant from the people into his narrow family. We moved from having a covenant with the people to a covenant with the house of David. What an interesting development.
Wow. Public theology as simply saying, no, this can't be. Courage coming from the power to say no. To disturb the rationalization of oppression and the sanctification of power dynamics. Thank you, Reverend Molo, for that prophetic word. Friends, I want to open the floor to all our fellows to ask your questions of Reverend Molo. You can just use the hand raise button as usual. There's a lot here, so I just want to encourage you. Please don't be shy. Yeah, Sarah.
Thank you. I have a question that I always wanted to ask as a South African, so I had it ready. But then this talk was just so great. Thank you. It did a number of things for me. I am really comforted at the deepest core of who I am, to be honest. Because to be a threshold person means to always feel uncomfortable. And thank you for, yeah, kind of like affirming that. And also, yeah, it challenged me to just continue being that person to its logical conclusion instead of kind of retracting, because you're always tempted to retract and go back. And thank you also for the anatomy of courage that you gave us. There's just so much there. But I'm just gonna ask one question that I always wanted to ask a South African. You seem to be perfect for this. Um, so as Ethiopians, uh, we often feel that we are the exceptional of Africa because we're not colonized. Um, but I struggle with that a lot because I think we share with a lot of the rest of African um, countries that our politics is caught up with a desire to keep the enemy out, and to where for other African countries it is about expunging the enemy. For us, it's about keeping the enemy out, and then we form a community around that attempt to keep the enemy out. And the South African project is very unique because it actually, um, instead of expunging the enemy is brought into a very complex historical process. So instead of talking about Ethiopian exceptionalism, I'm always interested in the South African exemplarism. Can you say what the role of the church was in that process and how that might, how other African churches might learn from that in their current very complicated relationship with internal and external enemies?
Do I take each question, or do we maybe have a group of questions that we can deal with?
We'll go one by one, if that's okay with you.
No, that's fine, Chase. Thank you for that, and thank you for your response. The South African church is one that is, in many ways, what I call a searching for its space in its public ministry. And I say that because part of the history of South Africa, as I tried to say, we live in this tension of the justifiers of the system. There are those who were whatever else I've said about that. Yet, precisely because of our history in South Africa, we have learned to say, what does it mean to be church in a place where you have to live with the contradiction of building a nation where the one who is the oppressor is not taken out of the context, if you see what I mean. We share this land. We live in this space. P.W. Botha had died here. He didn't leave. We didn't chase him out of the country. He remained in the country. And the complexity of that forces the church to deal with serious issues. One of the issues we're trying to deal with, what is reconciliation? And it's a difficult question to answer because there are easy routes to reconciliation. And those routes are conversation around, let's forget the past, let's live nicely together. Let us just do what makes everybody feel happy. And in South Africa, for example, we have used sport as a way to make us forget the realities of our lives together. And because sport is that, then we live with this illusion that we're a reconciled society. Yet there are many of us who are asking the deep question, what is reconciliation without restitution? What is reconciliation without a fundamental transformation of the economic realities of our people? What is reconciliation when poverty, 99% of poverty, is locked in Black existence? What is reconciliation in a space whereby your opportunities for education is directly linked to the economic power of your parents, not your ability to learn, not your commitment, not even your dedication? What is reconciliation when access to health is determined not by your need, but is determined by the interlocutors of private money, private interest, that has so privatized healthcare that the private sector at best is doing the primary care, which is not really at the highest order of what primary care is. And there is a direct link from the history to where it's at. So these issues are not easy to answer. And the church lives then in this dynamism that exists and saying, who is the enemy then? How do you live with this person in reconstructing a different reality? You can't chase them out. You can't go into their homes and strip them off, whatever else. How do you live with this tension that says we want to build a radically different space? Those in power will always preserve their power. They will want to go to easy answers. These issues are because you are lazy. These issues are because you are not able to do this or that. So we live with that tension, Sarah. We live with that, and therefore it's not easy for the enemy to be seen as out there. And because we live with that tension, we must learn to live with the possibility that those who are with us do not share the vision of the future as we want it to have. But because we are committed to a radical different world, we choose to work with them, even to our cost. And some of the young people in South Africa have lost patience with that idea. So there's a deep sense of discontent because what they look for their parents and what they look when it's happening, they cannot see the transformation. And there are many in South Africa who say Mandela was a sellout because Mandela did not change the economic structure of the country. So there is therefore that tension, and that tension is difficult to manage. But we keep at it because we've got a commitment to that vision. I normally say to people, the best way to live with the realities of those who disagree with you is to remember you are not committed to their disagreement with you. You are committed to the radical vision and dream that you believe is the best for the world. And if you are committed to that vision, to that dream, their disagreement is an irritation, is a hurdle, it is a difficulty, that you endure patiently. I normally say to people there's something called the impatience of revolutionaries, which must remain patient for the ultimate. They're impatient with oppression, but you are patient with the pursuit of that radical different world, so that you don't lose your own humanity and don't lose the vision of the world in your impatience with the oppression that is part of you. That's how we struggle with it. We haven't found the perfect thing. South Africans, if you read a lot of South Africans, are those who critique Tutu for the rainbowism, who argue that Tutu was too quick to declare South Africans to be a rainbow nation, because it was not a rainbow nation. Now, those of us who lived enough in 1998, those of you who can Google Thabo Mbeki's statement of 1998, where he says we are not one nation, we are two nations, one white and rich, and one black and poor. Then he argues that if reconciliation is going to have any substance, it has to change radically the living conditions of black people. But black people are lifted into a dignified living that is able to help them see reconciliation not as a feeling, but as a commitment to a different world, Sarah. So we live with those tensions. We haven't found it yet. The problem with the African church, if I can speak honestly with you, the African church is still caught up in the post-colonial prison. What do I mean by that? They still want to see their ministry as being loyal to the liberation movements without having a critique of the excesses, the abuses, and the rampant corruption of those society, of those kind of things, who have not spent enough time to even critique fundamentally tribalism and nationalism.
Wow. Thank you, Reverend Molo. Okay, anybody else have a question?
Reverend Molo, I'll jump in while our fellows are formulating their questions. First of all, thank you so
you'll
much.
be up next.
I feel like this session has been like opening a window, and there's just been this gust of fresh air that's come into my soul. So when you become salt and you have the courage to say no, and you both resist the systemic oppression, but you also name the excesses and corruptions of the resistors, so easily you start getting character assassinated. People will say, "Oh, see, you really are anti-freedom, anti-liberation. You are, you could be anti-black, you could be anti-white, depending on the context." People start trying to situate you in their own way. For example, when I was critiquing the civil war in Ethiopia, I was hammered again and again as being for the party in the north that was against the federal government. How do we inhabit that space where we're critiquing kind of all parties, but we're getting hammered by all parties at the same time?
Thank you, Andrew. I'll give you an example. When Donald Trump decided to tell Afrikaners that, well, by that you mean Afrikaners, that they've got a home in the US, we decided that we as Black church leaders will be quiet. We wanted the white church to speak. And I'm situating that to say, Andrew, sometimes we all must learn who is the best spokesperson at a given moment. Because the reality is that if we speak prematurely, doesn't mean you change your commitments. Easily lumped into a narrative that disempowers the potency of your critique, and your interests are impugned, And then what happens is that your messaging gets lost. And therefore, I say to my church leaders, sometimes we must ask the question, who must speak first? When I was a student activist in my years at university, we used to say, when you are going to go to the management and put a point over the management, we used to say, those who articulate, keep your mouth shut. Let those who English is, for many of them, English language, will say to people, you can break English up and down. All we want them to see is for them to see the raw emotions of what you say, so that they can experience what you experience. They might not know every word, but they will feel what you need to do. So that those who are articulate do not create a confusion of messaging that is so sanitized, that is so beautiful, that it pacifies the ones who are listening. So sometimes it is asked the question, who must speak when? And that creates a very difficult position. Have I earned the credibility in the eyes of those I'm speaking at to be able to speak frankly and openly with them? Do they know me as their partner in struggle? Do they know my commitments? Do they know my vision for the world? So that when I speak, I don't speak in a vacuum. I don't speak as a critic who's neutral. I critique them as one committed to the same values of the world that they have. So that's the first thing I want to say. And the second thing I want to say, and is simply this. Just remember this. The powerful, whatever leverage and people, wherever they find their power, whether it is let me make a simple example. I've heard many Black South Africans who fight racism, and who fight racism with everything that they have. And they know the liberative tools of interpreting scripture when they fight racism. When you talk about LGBTQI or gender-based violence, somewhere, somehow, they become stupid. Somewhere, somehow, they lose their intellectual morality. They lose the hermeneutical tools that allow them to engage the scripture in the Bible. They lose those hermeneutical tools. And the only answer that I get is simply this. They have now entered the realm of power. In this instance, they are the ones who are powerful. And because they are the ones who are powerful, the tendencies of the oppressor are being transported into this place, where we are now told that the Bible is clear on this, is clear on that, is clear on that. And therefore, part of the reality is we must always be alert that we can be situated within power dynamics. And those who are in power will do anything and everything to preserve their power. And if that means maligning, if that means critiquing people, it means telling people that they are siding with this or that or that or that, they will do that, because you are dealing with the powerful dynamic of how to become a servant of the wounded in the presence of the powerful. And in this locality that we speak about, they might be the ones in power. And therefore, do not be surprised when they are critiqued. Naomi Chomsky said something once, and it stuck with me. Naomi Chomsky said something to the effect, the problem with you, Christians and people who read the Bible, create the impression that the prophets were in the majority in the Bible. The prophets were always in the minority in the Bible. So remember that. Amos's voice, not because he was in the minority, not majority. His voice is kept because it is a voice of a radically different world. Somehow, it survived the codification and canonization of the church, whilst it is a critique of power.
All right, Galata. Thank you for that Noam Chomsky quote as well. Brilliant.
Thank you so much. It was quite insightful lecture. Even though I'm somewhat struggling to locate myself, I mean, the church is a big deal for me. And yeah, my question is, you mentioned about the African church being in a post-colonial context until now. And in the post-colonial setting, I think both the church and society, or societies like South Africa, Ethiopia, and the global South itself, are entangled with the complex, web of power dynamics at the global scale, and our political leaders often navigate between this structural survival and the moral imperatives of governance, and they are struggling themselves. So how do you think we can be compassionate towards our political leaders themselves who are struggling and navigating between survival, between this web of complex, global power dynamics? As well as my second question is, the African church, as it appears to me, its theology is quite underdeveloped, and much of our theology is from the north, from Europeans. So do you think the theology of enculturation could help the church to reclaim its authenticity and become unapologetically incarnated in its local, at the same time globally profiting?
Thank you, Galata. I'm going to preface my response to you by, I'm just coming from Interfaith G20 conversation in the last week. That Interfaith G20 is happening because South Africa is going to be the president of the G20. Donald Trump is going to take over from the 1st of December. For now, South Africa is the president. So there is this conversation to say, how do we speak about that? And the point you are raising is a very critical one. How do you exist as a prophetic church alert to the realities of the geopolitics of the world, the power dynamics, and the vested interests that exist in colonial masters who want to still control the riches, the power dynamics? African presidents are assassinated, not because people hate them, but there's a machinery of hate that is generated amongst them, so that if the people cannot hate them, somebody in the military can be raised to kill them. You are not blind to that. You're not blind to the fact that France still wants to impose its own economic interest on the Francophone countries in Africa. You can't delink the challenges of the world with the minerals scramble that is taking place now around the minerals that are related to what we call clean energy development. That is linked to this thing that I call the phone that I have. How all those things are interlinked into making sure that the African subservient state is kept. So you need to be alert to that, so that when we critique our leaders, engage them, we engage them with the clarity of knowledge that they operate in this space. And how then in that space do we critique them without, and this is where the next word must come, without creating idolatry on them? How do we make sure that we do not idolize them to the point that they become our gods? That they are so much beyond critique that we must get what they give us. We must take what they give us. The only thing that I try to do, because I live in South Africa, where the past 30 years I've lived with the high hopes of freedom and with the deep despondency of what that has done how the political elite have betrayed so many of our basic values. And I've lived with that. The SACC, which I lead, initially moved what is called critical solidarity. We developed this idea that because the governments we lead have got legitimacy, they represent the people, then we live with them in critical solidarity. In other words, because they are here to serve the people, we live in that critical solidarity with them, and then we work with them as best as we can. What I have come to, Galeta, as my point of departure right now, is to ask the question, can I be loyal to the people first? Not the leaders first. Can I be loyal to the people first? And what I mean by that is, my point of departure is, where do the poor in South Africa land? In the geopolitical and in the national politics, where do they land? Because I have learned, and that's the point I made in this conversation, that it is possible. I don't want to appear too clever. You guys would have read Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon has got a wonderful chapter called The Limitation of Nationalism in that Wretched of the Earth book. One of the things that Frantz Fanon raises for me is this idea that it is easy for the elites of recently liberated countries to be co-opted into the culture and the proclivities of the powerful. How they themselves then want to be absorbed into these spaces where they end up becoming the ones now who possess riches. And how then do we then live with that critical presence in our countries to say, if you serve the people, even when you make a mistake, we are going to live with you because we know where you are. But if you exploit our people, don't use colonialism as a rationalization of your own ineptitude, your own greed, your own inability to center the concerns of our people. In South Africa, I tell people, when I criticized Jacob Zuma or Thabo Mbeki, they used to say here, don't criticize those because you didn't criticize P.W. Botha or F.W. de Klerk, the white ones. I tell people, South Africans, my standard of leadership, it is not my oppressor. My standard of leadership is the great aspiration that those who sacrifice for our liberation have put as a standard. So when I measure my African brothers and sisters, I don't measure them with what Macron is doing. I ask the question, what would Kwame Nkrumah have set out to do? That's my standard. And if you do not measure up to that standard, I will raise my voice. Not because I believe that Macron is doing the right thing. Not because Tony Blair messed up Zimbabwe. Tony Blair in 1980. We can make that noise without saying to Mugabe, there's another way of dealing with our people with dignity. Those two do not necessarily fight each other. The development of our theology, I'm with you, Khaled. That part of the reality is our theological pots are not made from within Africa. John Beatty has made the past. You would know what Gustavo Gutierrez said in Latin America around that very basic point of developing that is made of our own pots, something like that effect. And that's the challenge we all face. A challenge we all face to begin. And I, personally, Galette, I don't even start at theological treatise. I start even in designing hymns, the poetry of our theology, the liturgies that we design, that allows us to imagine differently, that allows us to infuse our language and our people's imagination into the expression of God, into the search of who God is, and allowing our people's metaphors to infuse, because the more we remain silent, the more impoverished the world is. We do not owe it as only as a matter of protest. We owe it because it is a matter of enriching the world. The world is poorer because we excluded. Second, we allowed us that exclusion by being accomplices. But most importantly, we allow it right now by refusing to impute, to put into the mixture of what is theology at the end of the day. It is simply the ability to talk about God in our lived experiences. That's really what it is, ultimately. So I agree with you that there's a need then to begin. My point is, I don't even start with treaties. I'm starting with basic things like our hymns, our liturgies, our language, our imagination, how that can be put into that space.
Reverend Molo, as you were saying about your standard for leadership not being your oppressor, but those who have sacrificed for our liberation, I was just thinking about how worshiping a crucified Christ who was put to death by religious and state authorities is like kind of the ultimate witness to that. And how, I don't know, this act of resistance and struggle towards liberation is just continuing that tradition that's thousands of years old. So thank you for testifying to that. I think you have time for one or two more questions.
I can take them. I'm just worried about my battery now. But I'm willing to take, my battery's at 8% now. I made a mistake in not bringing my charger here. But I'm willing to take any question.
No worries. We'll take as long as we can get with the 8%.
Reverend Molo, we had a question in our chat from Tizita. Tizita asked, under dictatorship, when most nonviolent actions are not allowed and full allegiance with the government is expected, what is your practical recommendation?
Hey, sorry, do you hear me? Hello? Hello?
We hear you.
We can hear you.
Thank you, thank you. Let me submit my inability to connect with that question. Not because theoretically it doesn't make sense. It is simply because I've not lived in it. And I want to be humble enough not to even try to say to anybody, I've got an answer to that. Because in the worst days of apartheid, we still could go to church. We still could preach. We still could say that there is a God who took the Israelites out of Egypt into Canaan. So I really want to simply submit that I'm ill-equipped to answer that question, because it is one that I have not, and I want to be humble about it. Otherwise, I'm going to speak things that I do not know. What I hope for, there was a time in South Africa where we lived on what is called state of emergency, where we lived in a space whereby you could not come out into the public, into the open spaces. That's the closest I could talk about being in that thing. And what we did in those times, it is to build resilience, both in imagination and in spirit. In other words, we knew we can't go and protest in the streets, but we could gather in a small room, in a house. I think the Latin Americans have got a word for it. I've just forgotten that word. The Latin Americans have got a word for it, where they went into, people go to work during the day. In the evening, they go into church halls, and in the basement of things-based communities, I think that's what they call them. In the basements, they come and they just share. What does God mean to you today in the context of what we are going through? And people will share their ideas. will share their thoughts, they will pray together, they will strengthen one another and build enough resilience, because one of the most powerful tools for a dictatorship is the ability to isolate and create examples for what I call public lynching. For me, part of the truth about the crucifixion of Jesus, Jesus was not in many ways, Jesus was not the one who was the real target. The real target is the people. Because if you intimidate the people to crucifixion, you disempower them. So how then do you build resilience? Getting people to these base communities, to these spaces where they come together, they pray together, they speak together. What does it mean to be a follower of Christ in a mine? What does it mean to be a follower of Christ as a policeman or woman? What does it mean to be a follower of Christ as a soldier? Hopefully over time, you build enough resilience and imagination. But to be frank with you, I've never lived in a dictatorship in that context where I can offer any ideas. I have to be humble enough about that to say I'm ill-equipped for that. I'm looking forward to hearing stories from people who have lived through dictatorships, who have been resilient in telling the story, in imagining, and strengthened over time.
Reverend Molo, before we do maybe a final question, I was wondering if we could take a quick picture together, just
That's
in
fine.
case your computer
I'm
dies.
open for that.
Okay, fellas, if we could all turn on our cameras just for a second. I would appreciate that. Okay, give me 1 minute. I'm trying to shift my screen. Okay, Reverend Molo, I can't see your camera.
You can't see my camera.
No, it's just an M.
Did I? Oh, goodness me. I thought I was visible.
You were for the vast majority, just like the last 1 minute.
Ooh,
It was
goodness me. What did I do to this thing of yours now? I don't know. I don't know what I did to this thing now. Oh, there it is.
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
All right, if everyone can give me a big smile. That'd be good. Oh, give me one more try, guys. Okay, awesome. Thank you. And it's so great to see all of your faces. All right, let's try to do one closing question, if anyone would be brave enough to ask. Yeah, Malak. Please.
Thanks, Reverend Molo, for the content, for your passion. And I appreciate your passion so much. My question is, I live in a country in Sweden. I'm familiar with the church theology as an evangelical believer. That the church is neutral. It poses as a neutral position. So I'm familiar with that. But the prophetic tradition, it's new for me. I've learned it here. I've listened from your experience. So I want you to add more words on this tradition. I mean, what exactly did you do in the presence of operation? What exactly the church do? I mean, I thought I used to think that these roles were left for the activists or for the policemen. That see that the church is obliged to oppose the oppression. So, what was exactly happening? What was exactly the church? You could add more words on this I would be very much happy. Thank you.
Can somebody please help me, because I struggle to hear Malik. Malak, somebody just summarize the question for me, please.
Malak,
Okay. You haven't heard me?
Malak
Let me
said that
take it.
he's familiar with church theology that tries to remain neutral, but prophetic theology is new to him. So can you say more about how you developed into prophetic theology in a context of oppression?
Okay, thank you. I'm summarize this. When the drafters of the Kairos document began to draft the document, they decided to go into communities, again inspired by the Latin American experience, to simply ask the question, what is it that people think God is saying to them about their situation? And that created then this kind of radical connection in the people's imagination, because the people began to say, I hear my pastor, however, telling me that I should be happy, but I can't be happy with this. God cannot be happy with this. And then they begin to hear and connect these voices of the people with the voices in scripture that were these disruptive voices that began to, you see, when the oppressed tell you in a township that the police have arrested my child, and you are telling me that God is happy with that, I'm not prepared to serve that God. And when they say that, then you connect and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to and freedom to the captives. Then you're able then to connect the cries of the people and connect that with that radical strength in scripture that allows you then to see and speak differently. And out of that imagination, then you connect the people's imagination and yearning for freedom and God's commitment to freedom. And that creates then this prophetic engagement. Now, the prophetic church is not a formal institutional church. Let me say that very clear. It exists within this institutional church. It exists as I metaphor earlier on as the minority, but it exists therefore within the prophetic church doesn't exist outside of the church, but it is not the institutional church. And therefore it seeks to hear God's protest against powers, against poverty, against injustice. And when it hears God's protest against justice, it discovered actually at the center of God's redeeming work is a pursuit for justice and radical love. But at the corner, and that's what Guterres helps us to understand, that at the center of God's pursuit for this thing called salvation, it is a complete salvific endeavor that does not create individuals for heaven, that creates heaven in communal living as a pursuit of God, not as an optional extra, but as that thing that God wants us to be at the center. So therefore, I cannot be saved for myself. I'm saved for love to triumph. I'm saved for justice to triumph. And therefore, salvation, therefore, is broader than what the church has taught us. By the way, we don't have time for that. That is not how the church existed in history. For the church of now, its birthplace is Constantine. Its birthplace, its worship of power is located in Constantine, not in the gospel of Christ. And by the way, this God of the crucified one, this God of the crucified one, is not the one that Plato tells us about. That's not the God of the Plato tells us. What is it? Immovable, unchangeable. That God is not the God of the gospel. For that the God of the gospel love takes to be wounded. Is moved by injustice. And therefore, part of the liberation of the work that we need to do is to liberate the church. I think it is, before I lose my power, who was this Old Testament scholar? I think he's American. Who's this guy? I've forgotten him now. I don't know. He wrote a lot of books. He wrote Old Testament theology. He wrote the Poetics of the Prophets. Who's that guy? I've forgotten his name now.
Walter Brueggemann.
Walter Brueggemann. Brueggemann has made, I don't know which book it was, he made a statement that's to the point that says the liberation of the Israelites, whoever in Egypt, is partly the liberation of God from the clutches of the powerful. In other words, our quest to bring justice and liberation at the center of our gospel mission is also liberating God from the clutches of the powerful. Because the God imagined by the world is the God firmly controlled by the powerful. Therefore, when you recenter justice, you're also liberating God. Now, the church won't want you to hear that because God is this free agent that cannot be that cannot be controlled. But we know that in power dynamics, the powerful, the media can develop narratives that control who God is. And I found that quite interesting, that our pursuit is also to liberate God from the hands of the powerful.
Thank you so much, Reverend Molo, for your time, for all that you've shared with us. I'm just thinking about your words, the prophetic church seeks to hear God's protest. And just a radical vision of what it would look like to kind of tune our ears to hearing that protest. Who would we need to see and love and listen to actually be able to hear God's cries and his protests against power and poverty, like you said? So I just feel so energized by this. Fellows, thank you for all of your questions. Could we just take a second, maybe unmute ourselves to say thank you to Reverend Molo? Might be a little chaotic, but
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was really profound. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, my friends. Andrew, I will come back to you because there is a move in South Africa based on hope that maybe the church in South Africa must go to speak to the church in the US so as to counter the Trump narrative, at least about South Africa, that maybe we need to organize a visit where we can speak to groups of people to say whatever else you've heard. Elon Musk, is it Musk? What's this guy? Is this Musk? Leon, is it whatever this guy is? This South African who has found his way to be at the center of your power, to say that is
8%.
Almost had him.
Woo! Well, I look forward to reconnecting with Reverend Molo to come and bring a South African voice to what Trump and Musk are saying about South Africa and about God here in the U.S. And there is a very prophetic church in Chicago that I know would be very excited to platform this message. Friends, I feel deeply energized and challenged and refreshed, and like I need to spend some time really integrating what we've just heard, because I hope it's clear that Reverend Molo wasn't just giving us sound bites. Although he was very quotable, his words were very eloquent and very powerful, but he wasn't giving us disconnected sound bites, but he was giving us commentary from his lived experience and from his lived leadership in his community. And I hope that we can take time to let this really integrate and challenge us. Um, I really wish we could take a whole another hour to talk about how do you think this applies to your own lived experience in your own context. Because I was hearing so many connections with the US, so many connections with Ethiopia, but I know we're already 10 minutes over and we want to respect your time. But maybe in the chat in WhatsApp, if you want to just name a place where you saw resonance or application or prophetic engagement with your context, I would love to hear that. Thank you. Chase, handing it back to you to close us out with some silence.
Before we do our usual 10 to 15 seconds of silence, I also wanted to remind you all that the midterm assignment is coming up next week. If you have any questions about it, please message me or Andrew, and we would be so happy to help you out, generate some ideas. We don't want this to be something that's necessarily stressful for you as much as just thought-provoking and training our eyes and ears to see what's around us. All right, let's take 10 seconds in silence, and then I will close this out for this Saturday. Friends, until next week, may you discern what is yours to say and to do, guided by courage and held in love. We'll see you next week.
Amen. Thank you so much.